Episode 7, The Ideas That Changed Christianity, an AP European History podcast by Hammer History Productions. All right, so I'm going to be honest, I've been thinking about something completely unrelated to history all week.
That sounds promising, Miles.
Homecoming. I'm trying to figure out how I should ask someone to homecoming and, how big of a deal it actually is.
A classic crisis of confidence.
Yeah, because it feels like if I do it, it's kind of a big move, and if I don't, I'm going to regret it.
So you're weighing risk and consequence.
Exactly.
That's actually a pretty good way to think about Martin Luther.
Wait, seriously?
Absolutely. Luther made a decision that felt like a personal stand, but it ended up reshaping all of European society.
Okay, that's slightly higher stakes than homecoming.
Slightly.
All right, so today's question is, what were the central ideas of the Reformers and why did people actually care? Because it feels like this starts as a religious argument, but it turns into something much bigger.
That's exactly right. And to understand that, we need to start with the problem Luther thought he was fixing.
So what was wrong with the church in the first place? Because we've already seen criticism back in the late Middle Ages.
That's a really important connection, Miles. Luther isn't the first person to criticize the church. In fact, there were earlier reformers like John Wycliffe in England and Jan Hus in Bohemia.
Wait, so Luther's not the first one to try this?
Not at all. Wycliffe, writing in the late 1400s, argued that the Bible, not the church, should be the ultimate authority. He also pushed for translating scripture into the vernacular.
That sounds a lot like Luther.
It does. And Jan Hus takes those ideas even further in Bohemia. He criticizes church corruption and argues that true authority comes from scripture and a morally upright clergy.
What happens to Hus?
He is executed for heresy in 1415 after being promised safe conduct to a church council.
So earlier reformers tried this, and it didn't go well.
Exactly. Which makes Luther's success even more significant. The criticisms were already there. Luther just emerges at the right moment, with the printing press and more political support.
So Luther isn't starting the conversation. He's accelerating it.
Yes, and that's important continuity. People had been frustrated with the church for a long time, especially with corruption and the behavior of the clergy.
What kind of corruption are we talking about?
Several specific practices really bothered people. One was absenteeism, where clergy, like bishops, were officially in charge of a region but didn't actually live there or perform their duties.
So they're getting paid but not doing the job?
Exactly.
And closely related to that is pluralism, where one person held multiple church offices at the same time.
That sounds like they're spreading themselves way too thin.
Or not really doing any of those jobs properly. It reinforced the idea that church positions were about income and status, not spiritual leadership.
So people see this and think, the system itself is broken.
Right? Indulgences become the flashpoint, but they're really part of a larger pattern of frustration with the church.
Is this where indulgences come in?
Exactly. An indulgence was a payment to the church that was supposed to reduce time in purgatory.
Okay, so paying to get out of punishment after death?
That's how many people understood it, yes.
And for ordinary people, that mattered deeply. Religion wasn't just a belief system. It shaped daily life, death, and what people believed would happen to their souls.
So if you're worried about purgatory and someone says you can pay to reduce your time there, that's a big deal.
Exactly. But Luther believed this practice had become corrupt and was not supported by Scripture.
And that's where he steps in?
Yes. In 1517, Martin Luther, a German monk, published his 95 Theses.
What were those exactly?
A list of arguments criticizing indulgences and broader church practices.
So he's basically calling out the church publicly?
Yes, and initially he likely intended to spark debate, not start a revolution.
It's also important to note that Luther first tried to keep his concerns within the church hierarchy. He wrote directly to his superiors, including his archbishop, raising concerns about indulgences.
So he's not trying to break away at first. He's trying to fix things from the inside?
Exactly.
And the 95 Theses themselves were written in Latin, which was the language of educated scholars and church officials.
So regular people weren't even supposed to read them?
Not initially. They were meant for academic debate within the church.
But once they were translated into the vernacular and printed, they reached a much wider audience.
So something that starts as an internal church discussion suddenly becomes public.
And that shift is what helps turn Luther's critique into a broader movement.
But it doesn't stay small.
No, it doesn't. And that's where his ideas become crucial.
So what exactly did Luther believe that made this different?
His most important idea was justification by faith alone.
Okay, define that for me.
Luther argued that salvation comes through faith, not through good works or church rituals.
So you don't earn your way to heaven, you just believe?
In simplified terms, yes.
And that challenges the entire system of the church, which emphasized sacraments and the role of clergy.
So if salvation is just about faith, what does that mean for priests?
That leads to another key idea, the priesthood of all believers.
Which means?
Every Christian has direct access to God. You don't need a priest as an intermediary.
That feels like a huge shift.
It is. It undermines the authority of the church hierarchy.
And this ties into Scripture too, right?
Yes, Luther emphasized sola scriptura, Scripture alone as the ultimate authority.
So instead of the church telling you what to believe, you go straight to the Bible.
Exactly.
But most people couldn't read Latin.
Which is why the use of the vernacular becomes important.
Everyday language instead of Latin?
Yes, reformers wanted people to read religious texts in their own language.
That makes religion way more personal.
And much harder for centralized authorities to control.
Okay, but how do these ideas spread so fast? Because this feels like it could have just stayed local.
The printing press is the key.
Right. We've talked about that with the Renaissance.
And now you see its full impact. Luther's ideas were printed, copied, and distributed across Europe very quickly.
Pamphlets, translations, sermons, suddenly ideas could reach a mass audience.
So instead of one monk arguing with church officials, now everyone is reading his arguments.
Exactly. The printing press turns a local critique into a continental movement.
That's kind of like something going viral today.
A very accurate comparison.
So now people are hearing these ideas. Why do they actually support them? Because not everyone would have the same reason.
That's the most important part of this section. Different groups were drawn to Luther for different reasons.
Let's start with rulers.
In the Holy Roman Empire, political authority was fragmented. German princes ruled their own territories and often resented the power of the Pope and the Emperor.
So supporting Luther helps them push back?
Yes, by adopting Protestantism, rulers could increase their independence and also seize church lands.
Wait, they could just take church property?
Legally, yes, once they rejected Catholic authority.
That's a huge financial incentive.
Exactly. Religious reform had very real economic and political benefits.
What about people in cities, like merchants or professionals?
Urban populations were often more literate and more exposed to new ideas. They were also more likely to resent church wealth and corruption.
So Luther's message about reform makes sense to them.
Yes, especially the emphasis on individual faith and access to Scripture.
And as commercial groups gained influence in this period, they were more willing to challenge traditional authorities.
And then peasants? Because I feel like they would hear something different.
They did. Peasants heard ideas like the priesthood of all believers and interpreted them in social terms.
Like equality?
Yes, some peasants believed that religious reform could lead to social and economic change.
Did Luther support that?
No. Luther's focus was religious, not social revolution.
This creates tension. Different groups think the Reformation means different things.
So everyone is backing the same movement, but for completely different reasons.
Exactly.
What about intellectuals? Is there a connection to humanism?
Very much so. Humanists emphasized returning to original sources, including the Bible.
So reformers are kind of continuing that idea.
Yes. They wanted to strip away later traditions and get back to early Christian teachings.
So this isn't totally out of nowhere. It builds on Renaissance ideas.
That continuity is important.
So at this point, Luther's ideas are spreading, different groups are supporting him. What happens next? And are there other reformers too, or is it just Luther?
That's a key point. Luther is not alone. Other reformers begin to develop their own versions of Protestantism.
One of the most important is Ulrich Zwingli in Zurich.
What makes him different?
Zwingli agrees with Luther on many things, like rejecting church authority and emphasizing Scripture, but he takes reform further. He removes religious images from churches and simplifies worship dramatically.
So even within the Reformation, people don't all agree.
Exactly. And those disagreements can become intense.
And what about Calvin? I feel like that name comes up a lot.
Yes, John Calvin becomes one of the most influential reformers, especially for the future of Protestantism.
What does he believe?
Calvin emphasizes predestination, the idea that God has already determined who will be saved and who will be damned.
Wait, so you can't change your fate at all?
According to Calvin, no. Salvation is entirely in God's hands.
But people look for signs that they might be among the saved, what Calvin calls the elect.
Like what kind of signs?
Discipline, hard work, moral behavior, living a godly life.
That sounds like it could shape how people live day to day.
It absolutely does. Calvinism becomes especially influential in places like Switzerland, the Netherlands, and later in England, and it will have a major impact on religious practices that eventually spread to North America.
So these ideas don't just stay in Europe. They carry forward into American history, too.
Exactly. Which makes Calvin incredibly important for understanding the long-term impact of the Reformation.
So now we've got Luther, Zwingli, and Calvin, all pushing reform in slightly different directions.
And that diversity is going to shape the conflicts that come next. Conflict becomes unavoidable. The Catholic Church cannot ignore this challenge to its authority.
Is this where the Diet of Worms comes in?
Yes. Luther is summoned before the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V and asked to recant his ideas.
And he refuses.
He does. He insists that his views are based on Scripture and cannot be withdrawn.
That feels like the moment where everything escalates.
It is. After this, Luther is declared an outlaw, but he continues to have support from German princes.
So he survives because of political backing.
Exactly.
Okay, so let me try to put this together. Luther starts by criticizing indulgences, but his ideas go way beyond that.
Yes.
He argues for faith alone, Scripture alone, and direct access to God.
Correct.
And those ideas spread because of the printing press.
Exactly.
But people support him for different reasons. Rulers want power, cities want reform, and peasants want change.
That's the key insight.
So it's not just a religious movement. It's political, economic, and social all at once.
Precisely.
Okay, I'm thinking about this now with my own situation. Not that asking someone to homecoming is the same as starting the Reformation.
We would hope not.
But Luther takes a risk and he probably doesn't know how big it's going to get.
That's a fair connection.
And once he does it, other people take that idea and run with it in ways he didn't expect.
Exactly. Historical movements often grow beyond their original intent.
So maybe the lesson is, sometimes you just take the risk?
That might be one takeaway.
All right, so today we saw how Luther's ideas challenged the church and why so many different groups supported the Reformation for their own reasons.
And next time, we'll see how those tensions play out politically.
In Episode 8, we'll look at how political tensions within the Holy Roman Empire shaped the Reformation and how Protestant ideas spread beyond German-speaking lands. Thanks for listening to the Once and Future Present. See you next time.